Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, The Landscape Regarding Student Diversity and Inclusion in Higher Education, Connecting Research, Law, and Policy. Our guest speaker is Art Coleman, and we'll have further introductions of him by our Executive Director of AAAED, by Shirley Wilshire. Just a few housekeeping tips. Today's session will be in listen-only mode. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box, and we will answer as many as time permits. Following today's session, you will receive an evaluation, and we ask that you complete it as we value your input on not only this event, but future events. You'll also receive HRCI credits for this session today, as well as a copy of the slides in the email that will go out. The American Association for Access, Equity, and Diversity was founded in 1974 and certainly has 4 decades of leadership in providing professional training to members, enabling them to be more successful and productive in their careers. If you are not currently a member, I know we had a lot of folks sign up who are not members. There is a link on the bottom here that we would invite you to join us. A couple things, save the date. Our national conference is in Atlanta, June 6th through the 8th. And again, we've provided a link that you could register there. A couple of other things of upcoming webinars. February 22nd, Essential Components of Effective Workplace Respect Training, Fran Sepler. If you don't know who Fran is, Fran was hired by the EEOC to develop the Effective Workplace Respect Training, recently released. And then March 1st, we have veteran hiring, 5 things you need to know to change now. So with that, I will turn this over to Shirley Wilshire, our Executive Director.
Thank you, Sandra, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce our esteemed presenter, let me just add that AAAED is right here diagonally across the street from the Executive Office buildings and the White House. We are therefore in the thick of issues as they relate to public policy, equal opportunity, as well as our esteemed training program. We urge you to join AAAED because it's your membership that allows us to stay here and to be your voice in Washington, D.C. I want to also add that we created the Fund for Leadership, Equity, Access, and Diversity a few years ago to be the research arm of AAAED. And we are embarking on a project next week in the Midwest to do listening sessions on the issue of campus hate, incivility, and bias. As you've been reading the clips, those issues seem to be increasing in frequency on college campuses. Please be on the lookout for invitations to our webinars and our survey. We need your input to make recommendations to the Academy and to colleges and universities on the question of how to resolve and address these issues of hate on campus. With that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Mr. Art Coleman. He is the managing partner and co-founder of Education Council, LLC in Washington, which provides integrated policy, strategy, and legal services to educators throughout the birth to post-secondary pipeline. In his capacity at Ed Council, a major part of Art's work centers on issues of higher education diversity, inclusion, and expression. He works with campus leaders and nonprofit organizations to help design and execute educationally grounded, legally sustainable policies and practices. He helps lead the work of the College Board's Access and Diversity Collaborative, which he'll tell you more about. Mr. Coleman is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights in the Clinton administration, where these issues were central to his work. I might add that he is a graduate with honors, and I won't give the year, from Duke Law School, and he graduated from UVA, University of Virginia, as a Phi Beta Kappa recipient. With that, I give you Mr. Art Coleman.
Thank you, Shirley, and thanks everyone for being here today for the conversation. Shirley, thank you for not giving the year. I'll just say that when you and I were both working in the Clinton administration, we were teenagers. So we'll just take that and go with it. I want to kick off this afternoon first by saying that you'll have access to download the webinar deck at the end of the presentation. And I'm going to touch on a couple of written materials that I will give you links to give you other foundational information about the points that are being made in the discussion today. And we have reserved some time at the end for questions that you can submit online so that we can capture as many of those before the end of the session. I want to start with just a brief intro, however, on our major themes as we set the stage. And before I get into the three themes you see here, I want to hit one point of context that, as the title suggests, the point of focus here today is on student diversity on college campuses. And while that's the theme, I want to sort of acknowledge and recognize the important relevance and intersectionality of issues of faculty and staffing diversity and inclusion to this set of issues. But as we are dealing with a discrete set of laws affecting students, as we are dealing with a particular set of cases affecting students, and frankly, with a discrete body of research that informs both law, policy, and practice, we've decided to keep the focus today on questions of students, but I want to make sure that we're clear that we understand the connectivity and intersectionality more broadly on college campuses. To start, just with a couple of big picture points, sometimes the issues of diversity and inclusion on campus, it seems like it's a roller coaster or tsunami, pick your metaphor. And I think one of the points I want to start with is we actually know a lot, and I think sometimes more than we give ourselves credit for. We are literally sitting on decades of research, practice, and now law that is fundamentally settled around core principles, best practice, and the kind of steps that colleges and universities can and should be taking to advance their diversity-related mission-oriented goals. And so that's an important foundation to raise the second point, which is, in the end, I have not been a part of conversations for the last quarter century where the first question, whether it was coming from a president, a provost, or a court, wasn't one about mission and mission orientation. And as we talk about diversity, and I will probably say this more than once or twice, let's bear in mind this isn't diversity for diversity's sake. This is about the educational benefits of diversity and the question of what institutions, what schools, what various departments are trying to achieve is central to the inquiry and ultimately the legal and policy analysis that may follow. And finally, as a matter of both process and substance, the notion of success, I think, can be only attained if you have robust, interdisciplinary, and data-driven teams who are collaborating at every stage of the process to ensure important points of connectivity. I will talk more about issues of governance, which are critical for success in this context. But I don't want to lose the point of having individuals who come together wearing different hats in an institutional setting to help be both leaders in setting direction and problem solvers as issues arise. I should also say, because the legal ethics police compel me to, nothing that I'm going to say here today should be taken as institution-specific advice. It is abundantly clear, based on the body of case law we are dealing with and the nature of the legal issues that are present in many of the issues I'll talk about, that facts matter. That context is an imperative to understanding how you apply different scenarios in different settings. And in fact, some institutions have different risk tolerance for risk, depending on the way the calculus is arrived at in terms of achieving certain goals. And so every institution is different. Every culture is different. Every orientation toward what can be done, what should be done, what must be done is different. And so I don't want anything that I say today to be understood as sort of a categorical one-size-fits-all piece of advice, even as I will talk through some baseline rules that I think are pretty clearly established in the law. And then finally, I want to make sure that all of you are aware of another organization that is leading a lot of this work. The College Board established the Access and Diversity Collaborative in 2004 in the immediate wake of Grutter and Gratz, when mostly enrollment officials were coming together at the time saying, we prevailed, but now what do we do tomorrow? And so for the better part of nearly 15 years, the Access and Diversity Collaborative, led by the College Board, but with a dozen or more national organizational sponsors and 50 plus institutions of higher education that are sponsors of the activity, have worked to host convenings, to present at seminars, and to develop written policy and practice guidance that can be useful tools and resources for institutions working to do this very hard work. All of the resources are available free online, and you can go to the link in the yellow box to get access to those resources. I highlight two here. The one on the right, the policy and legal syllabus, presents a useful framework for institutions to think through in terms of how they structure their questions and inquiries, along with specific resources cited that can be useful in that further deep dive. And most recently, we've just this past fall published Building an Evidence Base, where we've taken both Fisher II and the cases that predated Fisher II, now in essence 40 years of case law, to talk about the kind of evidence that can and should be present on campus as institutions are advancing the ball. There are segments of this webinar that are being derived from that source, and so that will give you more information on many of the themes that we have. If there are individuals or organizations interested in learning more about the ADC, feel free to contact me or folks at the College Board about affiliation there. So with that, let's go to some big picture background. I want to start, I'm going to try to avoid being overly legally in the weeds today, but I want to give just a big picture perspective on how we've gotten to this moment in time and what that suggests for where we are. For many years, and frankly still today in certain contexts, much of the focus around race and ethnicity conscious practices in particular, sometimes gender-based practices also, tied to issues of past discrimination. And we have a history in this country that I don't need to repeat for anyone on this phone or on this webinar that is highly relevant to the context of the questions we're raising. But there was an important pivot point in 1978 when in the Bakke decision, Justice Powell, in a singular opinion, recognized that in contrast to the backward-looking remedial focus that characterized and underpinned many of the race and ethnicity conscious practices at play, there was also a forward-looking, mission-driven interest that could justify race and ethnicity conscious practices. In 1978, he recognized that point. And from that concept, we have a court history that now literally we are celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Bakke decision this year, that have in toto affirmed both that concept, that is, that the educational benefits of diversity can sustain and support race and ethnicity conscious practices that are appropriately designed, developed, and implemented. In Grutter and Gratz in 2003, a quarter century later, the U.S. Supreme Court in the University of Michigan cases affirmed that Bakke principle and went on to give us a framework, some elements of which I'll talk through a bit as we go forward. So the court built on that concept and gave institutions really a blueprint for how to think about and look at questions of diversity, the benefits of diversity, particularly with respect to race and ethnicity conscious practices. In 2007, just sort of notable point that we had 9 justices agreeing on a point on this front, which almost never happens in a K through 12 case, that the principles of Grutter and Gratz and Bakke were indeed sound with respect to higher education institutions. And then, most recently, as you've no doubt seen in recent headlines, in 2013 and in 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court revisited the questions of diversity in higher education in Fisher I and Fisher II The belief being in some quarters that the court was poised to overrule past precedent and wipe out the benefits of diversity as a foundation for race-conscious practices. That did not happen. To the contrary, the court reaffirmed its now 40 years of precedent and shifted from this question of the Bakke concept to the Grutter framework to now a question of evidence. Within that framework, what is the kind and quality of evidence we should see and we should focus on? And that will be a part of our discussion going forward. Before we get there, however, I want to frame from, frankly, the work we at Education Council have done for years on this front, what the big basic questions are to think through, as many of you as institutional leaders should be looking at these questions of both the educational benefits of diversity, both how you get the diversity you need and then how you achieve the benefits once you have a diverse student body on campus. As you'll see suggested here, the underpinning here is a baseline of evidence across the board, but there are in essence three buckets, if you will, of activity. One centered on policy and practice, where there is absolute clarity and coherence around institutional or organizational goals and objectives, around what the benefits are you seek and how you attempt to get them. And that implicates the question of strategy and design principles that bear out not only in the admissions office, which is obviously the headline generator, but in financial aid policies and practices, in recruitment and outreach programs, and even in retention and enrichment programs. And so these principles actually extend beyond the question of just admissions, which is where most of the legal action has been. But it's important to combine that policy and practice component with an intentionality around governance, or in our sort of witty terms, process management. Do you actually have an enterprise where there is vision, direction, and a drive to achieve both an assessment of where you are and what a continuous improvement model looks like over time to continue to improve and build on the success of the past and address the challenges that may have occurred? Again, with this underpinning of evidence that will inform judgments every step of the way. And finally, a point that I think until relatively recently was too much lost in the higher education community, but it has surfaced with a force, and I would argue in some very important ways appropriately so, the question of student, faculty, and staff engagement. I think it's remarkable what we can learn from student voice. Students are sometimes smarter than we give them credit for. And I think the notion of engaging students, engaging faculty, and engaging staff as part of the policy design, development, and iteration process is both good for the development. It enhances, as I will explain later, legal sustainability, but it also gives you a framework where you've got a better sense of coherence and alignment, even as there will be issues that surface from time to time where disagreements erupt. So with that big picture, I want to reinforce a couple of points here before we dive into further details. I've talked about the fact that the Bakke decision in the cases moving forward centered on a forward-looking, mission-driven educational orientation. If you remember nothing else out of this webinar today, I think that is the most important sort of baseline takeaway, because without that, everything else sort of crumbles in analysis. And I would also suggest to you that as a matter of good practice, I would argue even as a matter of law, but that's a debatable point, if we are using the term affirmative action to describe the race and ethnicity conscious practices that may be relevant to some of your institutional diversity goals, if we're using the term affirmative action for that description, we're using a term that does not fit. I think historically, affirmative action has been a term that reflected a focus on race and ethnicity and sometimes gender and sex with respect to social justice and remedial efforts to change or to correct for bad past practices. And again, as I said at the outset, while some of those realities may well still exist, to the extent that institutions are advancing a diversity focus now in line with now 40 years of precedent, they are focused on this forward-looking lens, and I would argue affirmative action as a term For student purposes, I'm not talking about employees and I'm not talking about other staff or faculty. Affirmative action in this context is not a good fit. And at a minimum is a term that if you polled 100 people, they'd have 100 different definitions, and it creates a lot more heat than typically light. In that context, there is a question of how do we understand, know, or observe our mission? And so there are many sources that can help extrapolate and expand on what the educational goals are. I think experience, research, and frankly, the law now affirm the value proposition of having clear mission statements, of having clear policy documents, of having a sense of governance and leadership with expression around these views. There are multiple sources that can be distilled to arrive at the value proposition, the rationale, and the importance of diversity on campus. These are foundational pieces of evidence that have been used in many legal contexts to help affirm court rulings in favor of institutions. And finally, big picture, I also want to return to the notion that this is not a simple question of admissions or, for that matter, numbers. Numbers are an important part of the equation, to be sure, but they are a necessary but not sufficient condition for success, and we will talk about success as we move forward. I think the reality that is indisputably true, especially as we read the headlines and understand the issues and challenges of inclusion on campus and those that extend to issues of free expression and protest, is that everyone on campus has a role to play. This is no longer the exclusive province of the Dean of Admissions or the Chief Diversity Officer or some other individual who may have a title associated with diversity. We're going to focus today on the discussion around the enrollment realm and the leadership realm, but I don't want to take us, and that's just by virtue of sort of time limitations. I don't want us to lose the point that there are critical and key roles for individuals in leadership in co-curricular arenas, in student affairs, as well as in the classroom, to ensure that you've got a basic alignment. Because if you go back to the simple proposition where I started this conversation, this is a conversation about the educational benefits of diversity. You cannot achieve the educational benefits part of that conversation or that line without looking to what the student experience is and seeing how they can become an integral part of student and campus life to contribute robustly and not feel isolated because they somehow are different or perceived to be different. And so this notion of student inclusion and ultimately excellence in terms of educational outcomes, which the research also affirms, makes the big picture here from enrollment to curricular to co-curricular focus with support from leadership from the top down, critically important to success. So those are big picture points I wanted to begin with. Now let me turn to more specifics, starting with admissions and enrollment. And so let's go to admissions first and some first principles, because this is the area that is best developed in the case law. I think we have the clearest guidance on both what best practice is and what is legally required for institutions that are considering or pursuing race and ethnicity conscious practices, considerations of race and admissions, said differently, in their policy design. Let me start by acknowledging that just as every institutional mission is different, and it should be, I've never seen two admissions policies or programs that looked the same. If you looked at 100 institutions, you would find 100 different ways of advancing the goals of, as many term it, individualized holistic review. But that variance and variability, which is not only, I think, accepted, but to be expected, can't mask the underlying reality of what at core is present. And in a nutshell, I think what you see from the cases that have affirmed higher education admissions practices where there were considerations of race and ethnicity, but also by the advocacy led by many higher education institutions and national organizations. If you look just at the dozens and dozens of amicus briefs filed in the recent Fisher 1 and Fisher 2 cases where institutions of higher education set forth their process and their thinking and their philosophy of holistic review. You will find both variability, but you will also find something else. That they're not talking about a mechanical weighting of race in the admissions process. They are not talking about a thumb on the scale. And they certainly are not talking about establishing separate pools for review or anything that closely resembles quotas. They are looking at an authentic, holistic, individualized consideration of each individual in their particular profile, with every factor present from academic preparedness to special skills and abilities, backgrounds and obstacles overcome. All of that intersects with every other piece of that profile to inform judgments, not mechanics, around who's admitted and who is not. That story, both in terms of the top line and the underpinning of the real picture, I think is a really important one to internalize, because that's precisely the kind of policy and practice that the University of Texas prevailed with in Fisher. That is precisely the kind of policy and practice that many institutions of higher education held up as best practice in their amicus submissions and elsewhere. So if we move from the question of admissions, I also don't want to lose sight of the broader question of enrollment. And I think it's true on many, if not most, college campuses now that are either selective or semi-selective, that you have, in some form or fashion, an integrated enrollment strategy, or as many term it, enrollment management, where questions of admissions, scholarships, aid, recruitment, and outreach are all considered in tandem with each other. So I will say, from just a practice and policy standpoint, I think that indisputably constitutes best practice. I think over time what we have seen is an integrated, aligned system of strategies designed to create the student class that you seek to create every year, enhances synergies and improves outcomes, and you can identify and avoid inconsistencies or points of tension when you've got that kind of integration. But as importantly, speaking from a legal perspective, that alignment is actually rather essential in the legal context, where there are issues of consideration of race and ethnicity, whether it be in admissions, scholarships, or elsewhere. Because what the courts are going to look at in part is the question of the demonstrated need to consider race and ethnicity in any particular way. And part of the calculation and part of the analysis, frankly, and the court in Texas told us this for the first time, as we'll turn to in a minute, that integrated approach can be a really baseline for establishing success. For those of you who've been around the block a few times and have seen some of OCR's work at the Department of Education, I will tell you a common practice for them, even if they get a specific discrete inquiry about an alleged discriminatory financial aid policy or program, or an alleged discriminatory admissions practice, they're going to inquire more broadly, because they want to understand the relevant context into which those claims are pressed. And I think the broad inquiry is correct, as the University of Texas case in Fisher told us. So the takeaways for Fisher, and this is just to get a little more specific around the broad principles we have talked about. What Texas told us at the end of the day was that a foundation for legal sustainability was, in fact, an individualized, holistic review in the admissions process that lived up to its name. That, in fact, notably in the Texas case, and this is not unimportant, race could be a factor whether the student was white or black. Again, it depended in the context of the overall profile. And ultimately, race was considered in a contextual way. It was considered in light of all of the other elements of the student's profile. And I think notably, and this is probably, I think, one of the best questions and answers in any case of recent memory on this front, during a deposition, the Dean of Admissions at the University of Texas was pressed by opposing counsel about whether she could state, with regard to any specific applicant, how the consideration of race affected or not that applicant's chance and ultimate ability to be admitted. And she said quite clearly, and I'm paraphrasing here, that she clearly could not, because she could not divorce the question of a student's race from the other elements of the student's profile. And I think that's an exactly right answer. And I think that reflects the reality of the individualized holistic review that Texas advocated for and the court endorsed. The broader point, which I think is a point we have or should have long known, but is the first time the Supreme Court has actually specifically made this point, in considering the question of whether race in admissions was necessary for the University of Texas. It looked to the question of what viable other race-neutral alternatives or strategies might exist. And part of that inquiry here in the Supreme Court for the first time included an examination of the outreach and recruitment activity and the financial aid and scholarship activity. And the case that Texas made in spades, in my view, was that they had started 3 new race-neutral scholarships. They'd established new admissions centers all over the state of Texas. They'd increased their recruitment budget by over $500,000. And they had thousands more staff working to help achieve the goals they were trying to achieve through the development of a diverse class as a foundation for achieving the benefits of diversity on campus once students arrived. That investment told the court something. That investment said, we are serious about this diversity, and we take seriously our job to do everything that is both viable and feasible to achieve that diversity, but there are times that in limited and in nuanced ways we need to consider race, and this was one case in that context. Finally, I want to call attention to the fact that part of what the court's analysis undertook was an examination of student perception, and I think this may be the first time we've actually had a Supreme Court look at that in the way that it did in Texas. But student perceptions about isolation and needs and challenges on campus to help establish this question of the necessity of doing more came through and helped make and affirm the point that ultimately success is not just about the numbers. And so to that point, I want to turn to Section 3 and talk about a minute success. I've said for years the $64,000 question is, what is success and how do you know it when you achieve it? And I think the court in the Fisher case got closer to that question given the sophistication of Texas's arguments and the evidence it presented. But to distill it down to its core, again, with a focus on the multi-dimensional efforts that need to go in to make this about the educational benefits of diversity. Numbers have been an obsession of us in the academic world and certainly in the admissions and enrollment world, and at some level appropriately so. But for decades, I've been part of conversations where it's, well, what's critical mass? How do we know it when we achieve it? Is it 17%? Is it 22%? Is it different in different settings? How do we know? Critical mass, I will tell you, I think is one of the hardest and most challenging questions to get your head around, let alone to get policies in place around that exist. But that, while important to consider, and it is backed by a significant body of social science research that I won't go into, I will spare you all, I won't go into that here. What I want to suggest is, if we become so obsessed with the question of numbers and percentages or ranges, as was the benchmark in the Grutter and Gratz cases, we lose sight of the forest for the trees. But the question is ultimately, what is the student experience? What are students learning in classrooms? How are they interacting on campus? What is their perception of each other and themselves in terms of their acceptance on campus? And so what systems do we have in place, curricular and co-curricular, both to survey, to engage, to understand, and then to address as a matter of policy and practice those issues so that we are creating the kind of learning environment that will live up to the question of educational, not numerical success with these students. I think the question of numbers and the question of the underlying education go hand in hand at a certain level, but I want to suggest that the fundamental focus is and should be around understanding what's happening on the ground. And I think finally to this point, the evidence and the kind of case that the University of Texas made in this context basically just lays this out. I think I am Shirley didn't say I'm a recovering litigator. I was a trial lawyer for a decade before I came to Washington in 1993. And while I believe in the importance and power of research, the importance and power of statistics, and the importance and power of data, give me a story any day. And I was struck by the fact that this court, for the first time in this context, relied not just on data, not just on research, not just on reams of information coming from experts in the judgments that were made in Texas. It looked to the student experience, and in particular, student surveys, and this was the court's term, not mine, anecdotal information. And while anecdotal information is, to be sure, limited, it can be an important piece of the capture of what is going on. And here we're finding out, I think potentially for the first time in this context, certainly, it can play an important role in helping the court understand the nature, dimension, and strategies associated with both the challenges and opportunities that student diversity present. So big picture data, demographics, other information, hugely important, but let's not lose sight of the stories. And you heard that first from a recovering litigator. Finally, I want to wrap up sort of this baseline section, looking back at the question of the big picture here and governance, because even as we think about leveraging the important work and the expertise of enrollment leaders and officials, if ultimately success is defined by what students' lived experience is and what their educational outcomes are by virtue of their lived experience on campus, then we've got to think as a matter of systems design and through leadership, what it takes for an institution to be successful. Said differently, we can't have enrollment officials going off in a corner making decisions, and faculty going off in a corner reflecting on pedagogy and curriculum design, and student affairs folks going off in a corner thinking through strategies for student engagement on student activities. We actually need the connectivity here with a shared leadership model, and I will just share with you from my perspective, A, I think Texas was able to demonstrate that, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But B, fundamentally, from my experience of working with institutions over the course of many years, the pattern I either see as a foundation for success or that I want to see when I'm not seeing all the dots connected is, in essence, two-dimensional. One, with a leadership team that goes all the way to the top, that sets vision, direction, and strategic investment in line with the vision, values, and mission of the institution. And secondly, and importantly, an underlying set of systems and processes designed with a connectivity to both inform and spur conversation and challenge with that leadership team. So that you've got institutional research, you've got student affairs, you've got academic affairs, other facets of the institution that are driving change, providing data and information to inform leadership, and providing ultimately the glue that connects all of the dots. So those two strands, that leadership for vision and direction, informed by a system of strategic connectivity through a smart systems design, very much like holistic review. I've never been to two college campuses that had the same design, and that's okay, but the elements are relatively clear and should be there. And so finally, turning back to UT in this context, I want to highlight just that part of the behind the headlines story that was critical to UT's success was they could demonstrate a robust connectivity and an overarching governance where academic leadership embraced the foundational principles and policies that supported the practices that were challenged in their case. And so from a policy proposal to a study to a stakeholder committee engaging with various facets of the institution, they had strong evidence-based foundations for making the judgments they did in a thoughtful, deliberate, and strategic way. When you've got that kind of blueprint of action with those kinds of foundations, even if a court disagrees robustly with conclusions that may have been drawn, they are, I would argue, much less likely to rule it invalid as a matter of law, given the thought and deliberation that is in evidence, and the notion of academic freedom tied to the educational judgments that gets some limited but some not unimportant play in the court context. So as we wrap up, I've in relatively rapid fire form put a lot of information out there that can be both sort of overwhelming, and it wouldn't be the first time that someone reacted to this kind of discussion by saying, this is simply too much for me. I can't begin to tackle all of this. What I want to suggest at the outset is, while it may sound in a 45-minute span daunting and overwhelming, it is, in my experience, often less daunting and overwhelming than many realize, because frankly, for many institutions that maybe may not have attempted some of this important work in the ways suggested, what they realize pretty quickly when they undertake the work is they aren't starting from scratch. In fact, much of the effort at the outset can involve and should involve the inventory of what are the pieces that are already in place, what are the elements that are already moving, and how do we connect the dots among those various facets. And so literally establishing that baseline inventory of common practice to create a baseline understanding for action moving forward can be an important foundational step as we think through. And so as we think about what do I do tomorrow, because I know while there are many institutions that may be in that camp, there are other institutions that have undertaken this very hard work and that are continuing this work. And I think that's probably a major takeaway. The work is never done. This is, from my vantage, both from a legal and policy standpoint, a point of continual improvement where you build on success, you identify challenges, and you move forward in a data and evidence-enriched way. But as a kind of checklist of what you do and think about tomorrow, I want to offer 5 points that build on the themes from this discussion. 1, pay attention to mission. Literally as a legal foundation, critical. I would argue as an education and a management effectiveness and efficiency point, important. Do you have clear mission and related policy statements that appropriately reflect your commitment to diversity, defined in broad terms, I should say, while much of the discussion today has been around race and ethnicity, because that's where the law steps in most rigorously. The commitment to diversity, by definition, must be broader than just a question of race or ethnicity. And so do you have policy statements? Do you have statements of leaders that reflect that commitment, that articulate the rationales, and that make the case educationally for why diversity is important to you, for the student experience, and for the workforce and other civic outcomes that you hope students will glean and achieve by virtue of their association with your institution? So mission, number 1, always number 1. 2, the importance of looking at all enrollment policies. As we go into the weeds a bit and look at policy design and strategies around who do we attract and what yield do we get with respect to student diversity, particularly as it relates to legally race and ethnicity and gender-based practices, but I would argue as a matter of management and process more broadly than just those issues associated with diversity. You get better yields, you get smarter outcomes, and you get more enhanced legal sustainability if you're looking at the integration of aid, scholarships, admissions, recruitment, and outreach as part of an overall policy set, even as you do your deep dives and sometimes isolated dives within each of those cabins. Third, implicit and frankly spelled out in much of this conversation, there needs to be an integration of law in particular where you have the consideration of race and ethnicity or gender or other similar factors in admissions, where frankly, and this gets almost no headlines and almost no court cases, where those considerations are present in financial aid and scholarships. The legal questions are the same. They are addressed differently because, as Justice O'Connor said in Grutter, context matters. But there is important guidance that does exist on the question of race and ethnicity and gender-conscious financial aid and scholarships, including, surely back in the dark ages, when we put out in 1994 the Title VI policy guidance from the Department of Education that has withstood the test of time and been the foundation for subsequent affirmations by various administrations. While it's not been tested in the courts, because frankly there haven't been that many scholarship cases, I think it sets an important baseline for consideration for institutions that are looking at these questions, not just with respect to admissions, but with respect to financial aid and scholarships. Fourth, if there's anything that's clear in the case law where institutions are considering race, ethnicity, gender, etc., in admissions or other enrollment practices, and frankly, I know that admissions and other folks sort of do this anyway as part of an ongoing process. We're always assessing the numbers. We're always evaluating what happened with the last class and what could we do better to achieve perhaps a more desired outcome for the coming year. It is important to integrate this sort of legal lens that I've only touched on here as part of this periodic review and evaluation. As you think through, again, with particular focus on race, ethnicity, and the like, the necessity of making that consideration real in your admissions or aid or other practices, the likely and expected, and from past practice, positive impact that consideration can have, and ensuring that you've got the right level of nuance or flexibility in your design so that you don't trip into this overly mechanistic or formulaic pattern that frankly was a death knell for the University of Michigan undergraduate institution in the Gratz case, even as it prevailed in the law school case in Grutter in 2003. And then finally, a major theme of today, having the right sort of governance model that can reflect the vision of leadership as well as the systems underlaying it to give the richness and perspective on data and information that will allow leaders to make the most informed, mission-oriented judgments. And finally, in this last slide is simply a distillation of the evidence manual, that resource guide that I identified early on with the College Board's Access and Diversity Collaborative Materials. The question of evidence and the importance of having, for legal purposes, with respect to the consideration of race, ethnicity, and the like in enrollment practices, evidence around mission, governance, enrollment, and success. This distillation builds on yet the distillation of that resource guide, which is informed substantially by the court's opinion in the Fisher 2 versus University of Texas case, but also by the larger body of case law and federal policy coming from the Department of Education. So with that, I will stop, and I think we can open it up for questions.
Okay, so if you have a question, if you would, please type it in the chat box. Otherwise, if we have any questions that weren't answered in the presentation that came in earlier, Art, we could probably go ahead with those.
We'll give folks a couple of minutes and see if they've got questions would be great. While we're waiting, I've got one that came in, was on the question of financial aid, and it was simply the more open-ended question about the relevance of the non-discrimination principles to questions of financial aid and scholarships, independent of the question of admissions. And I alluded to this, but I think it's an important point to hit because, in my experience, many institutions are rightly paying attention to this set of issues in the context of admissions policies. And while I think there's attention on the financial aid front, it's not clear to me that the level of rigor is there in all cases that perhaps should be. And so what I would say at the outset is the very same legal principles under Title VI, under Title IX for public institutions, under the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution that establish this kind of strict scrutiny inquiry. And I've integrated a number of questions and elements in this conversation that address those. That inquiry applies equally, we believe, in a context of a challenge to a particular aid practice or a particular scholarship practice. That said, it is important to recognize, and the department in 1994 explicitly did this, to say that the fact that you reach a conclusion on a particular admissions policy doesn't necessarily mean that would be the same conclusion with respect to AAED, because AAED, by definition, is simply a different vehicle, a different kind of benefit, and the department recognized that. But the simple reality is, with respect to mission-focused, forward-looking policies, there is literally no federal case law of any consequence on the merits dealing with the question of scholarships. And so we are do our best to import the principles from admissions case law, but recognizing Justice O'Connor's admonition that context matters, which is a major theme of the Department of Education's 1994 policy guidance.
Shirley? Did you have any questions on your end there?
Well, I wanted to underscore why we had this webinar. And and I'm sure many of you have been reading. The Justice Department, again, you know, has been decided to reopen the whole issue of affirmative action or diversity in the complaint Asian students filed against Harvard. And that led to a major conference call from with the civil rights community on, are we going to have to revisit this battle again? Which some of us have been in for, I won't even count the years. And that's why we wanted you all to be thinking and being prepared, because we don't know what institution of higher education may be targeted after Harvard. And even though in my view, I don't even consider it, a standard affirmative action case. In fact, I might ask you, Art, what is your thinking about the complaint filed by Asian students? My concern is, even if you took race out of the equation, there would still be an issue that they would have, because their primary competition is with the white students. But I'd like your thoughts about the Harvard issue.
Yeah, I think we're looking at a sort of new generation and a new kind of case with that complaint. I'd go back to sort of first principles here. While you can't predict what any court is going to do tomorrow, the notion that the basic premise of the consideration of race or ethnicity admissions is somehow unlawful in the name of diversity as a sort of categorical proposition seems untenable to me in light of that demonstrable foundation. And so I've got to believe that Harvard, on a legal front, obviously starts with a sort of strong foundation to begin with. And I would just say, too, there's a point this makes me think of, because it gets very complex very fast, as you correctly note, Shirley. Several organizations and institutions actually made this point in their briefs in Fisher 2. The notion that a court would tell an institution of higher education, again, with all the sort of legal foundations we talked about and the design principles we talked about, that you couldn't consider a student's race or ethnicity in the context of an admissions decision, would be, in essence, to tell an institution, go consider the 52 other factors that you believe are important to that student. But where there is something in that student's life experience or trajectory that is important to you that is associated with their race, you have to read it in a race-blind or race-neutral way. Literally makes no sense. It becomes a sort of point that I think there is no compelling response to. And so the notion that you can divorce an individual's race or experience associated with race in the context of this holistic, individualized review that we talked about seems to me an untenable proposition at the end of the day. And I think one that is a pretty compelling argument that found its way in the Fisher case, and I think may well find its way again in the Harvard and UNC cases, which are percolating for the court. So once again, we've got two cases that we know of percolating of some public renown. I think they don't go to trial before the end of this year or sometime next, most likely. because I think there are motions and things coming up. So they are cases to watch, to be sure. But the lower courts are bound by court precedent. And so you've got that strong foundation, at least to begin with, even though, as Shirley, you correctly noted, it's a new dimension and a new kind of case.
I should add that I understand the person who is the motivation or motivator behind these cases is the same one, Mr. Blum, who was behind the Fisher case.
That is correct.
Again, the argument is that African Americans and Latinos are the ones who are the reason why Asian students aren't admitted at higher rates. That race, again, as you indicated, was a factor. Just the facts of it, the numbers are suggesting that it's not necessarily the case.
I would also say too, and I'm not holding myself out as the expert on all the details of the Harvard case for that matter, but it strikes me as likely very relevant in this context, sort of what has been, in essence, a kind of elephant in the room in all of these cases, but a sort of key component of every complaint I've ever seen filed on this front, which is the question of merit. And plaintiffs in these cases want to say, in essence, whether they admit it or not, that merit is effectively test scores and grades. And so everything else then is judged against that baseline. And what every college admissions official in any selective or semi-selective institution will tell you, as important as test scores and grades may well be, they are not the be-all and the end-all. And they are looking for other factors. If that were not the case, we could do college admissions by computer. We wouldn't need human beings making individualized judgments about student profiles, capacity, and frankly, their admission, because I think too often we lose sight of the fact that admissions officers are doing, in essence, two things. They are evaluating student profiles and backgrounds based on application materials to determine at a threshold, do they have the potential and are they likely to succeed at my institution, and do they meet some baseline threshold for that? But as importantly, number two, what kind of class do I want to assemble? What kind of learning environment do I want to create? What kind of institution do I need to establish to assure that students from many walks of life learn and interact and challenge, and sometimes in ways that students don't love, but as part of this growth trajectory, so that we are not only creating the rich learning environment that Justice Powell 40 years ago said is all about the robust exchange of ideas. If you want the robust exchange of ideas, you want people with different backgrounds and perspectives coming together. That is part of the lens of institutions of higher education today who are making these decisions in such a way.
I think while we're waiting for another question, that just leads to another point, that what's underreported is the actual selection process, admissions process at selective colleges. Because there is a lot of misinformation out there about, how admissions lacks, that students of color are disadvantaging other students because they don't merit being admitted. We've been fighting that battle for some time.
Yep, and I think where both certainly internally, colleges and universities are clear that there's some baseline threshold and everyone they admit is in fact qualified. It's a question of the mix. I think to your point, we have not done as good a job with transparency. I talk about this a lot. I think we actually need to enter a discomfort zone, if you will, and be more forthright and transparent, not on every detail and nuance of an admissions process, but to help educate the public. We have the court of law and we have the court of public opinion. I actually think the court of public opinion is more challenging than the court of law, because we in part have not done as good a job in our communications. And I would, if anyone is looking for a model, and there are a lot of reasons to say this, but the singular reason is not because they ultimately prevailed in a court of law. In my quarter century plus working on this set of issues, I think the single best admissions policy I have ever read is the University of Michigan's law school admissions policy. And it's in the record in Grutter. Go back, pull it, and read it from start to finish. It I'm going to turn back into a recovering litigator again. It tells a story. It tells a story about institutional values. It tells a story about academic standards. It gets into the question of grades and test scores. It talks expressly about how that's not the totality of what they are looking for. And then, and this is where I think they differentiate themselves from so many other institutions, because a lot of institutions do that. They embed anecdotes with identity scrubbed data about students they have admitted that tell the story from multiple directions and in multiple ways to affirm the value proposition in very intuitive and compelling ways. That story, I believe, is compelling. Now, that's not going to carry the day. After all, it helped in the law school case. It didn't help so much when there was the voter proposition a year or two after Michigan prevailed in Grutter. But I would say as a model to think through in terms of how we talk about these issues and engage both our own college and university communities as well as the public writ large, that one policy statement can be a model for consideration.
Okay, we'll give everyone one last chance here. We don't have any more questions. Shirley, anything, closing remarks?
Well, again, when you join AAAED, you're added to the listserv, and we will continue to send out stories and information as it relates to this issue. And again, we are watching to see what's going to happen at the Department of Justice, but stay tuned on your own, because we don't know. In addition to the administration revisiting this will probably prompt other right of center groups to challenge the admissions practices at institutions of higher education. Again, I want to thank Art for helping to arm you with the information that you need to be prepared to defend your practices in terms of admissions. Why we also, since many of our members are in the EEO, equal employment opportunity area, again, the concern is that once affirmative action or diversity is attacked in one arena, it can bleed over into others, such as employment. So let's be mindful of that, and stay tuned. Join us and join with others to let's monitor and let's try to protect what we've gained in equal opportunity in higher education. So I want to thank Art for taking the time and his staff. And thanks everyone for participating in this webinar.
Thanks, Shirley.
Thank you very much, and have a great day.